Okay. Hello, everybody, in person on Zoom. Thank you for coming to our first hybrid sociolinguistics lecture. So today our speaker is Juan Rodríguez. Juan is an associate professor of anthropology at Queen's College at CUNY. His expertise is on semiotic and linguistic ideologies, specifically how these are mobilized in the process of state formation and the emergence of diasporic identities. His work relies on a discourse-centered approach to language and culture, taking actual instances of language use and performative practices as the starting point of his ethnographic research. Juan combines this approach with an interest in practices of translation and semiotic transduction. He takes translation practices as part of a more general process of transduction of political speech into political influence through the distribution of state resources. His book, Language and Revolutionary Magic in the Orinoco Delta, explores the role of translation and transduction in the process of transforming oil revenue into political influence, arguing that these are interconnected processes that help us understand the place of Guarao speakers in the context of the Venezuelan public political sphere. Over the 2019 to 2020 year, he started a new research project in collaboration with Dr. Miki Makihara, funded by CUNY's PSC Research Foundation and a research enhancement grant from Queen's College, in which he explores linguistic intimacy in the Venezuelan diaspora in both Chile and the US. In this new project, he will conduct a multi-site ethnographic investigation on the ways in which the largest migratory phenomenon in the hemisphere have produced new linguistic and semiotic practices. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So what I'm going to present today is part of an ongoing project that I am carrying out with Miki, Dr. Miki Makihara, and that and these are ideas that even for her today is going to be a little new. So she's going to hear and also hear first. And this is a thing that I've been working on that is unfinished. You guys are going to see that it's a little bit unfinished and rough around the edges. But that is an idea that I think is worth putting into context today for the Venezuelan diaspora. So I'm going to read a little bit of the paper, and I'm going to go off script once in a while to complement the ideas that I'm going to be putting forward for you guys today, right? So Gallant Irvin pointed out that for Charles Hanspears, the unified subject is not the center of his philosophy, which is built, as they said, on acts of conjecture, not on persons. The first step in these acts of conjectures is to identify signs that become relevant to our attention. Then we make guesses as to what kinds of relationships such signs have with other objects and with other signs that they come to represent and be in a relationship with. This process does not require us to focus on persons doing the guessing, but teaches a great deal about the act of conjecture, or on how the act of conjecture can be cast onto people to make guesses about them. And this point is important to remember, because this is a lot of the theories of linguistics are based on that, right? On how people cast guesses onto the way in which other people speak. In this presentation, nonetheless, I will explore how focusing on acts of sociolinguistic conjecture instead of models of real personhood can help us understand the development of Venezuelan diasporic intimacy online. In doing so, I concentrate on how Venezuelans get involved in a reflexive linguistic form of conjectures, not casting guesses about others, but casting guesses about the self. And conjectures about the self as the center of attention, producing sociolinguistic imaginaries. In other words, Venezuelans in the diaspora produce a linguistic reflexivity that is conjectural. And the point of such conjectures is to produce a sense of affective closeness with linguistic forms that they didn't need to guess about in the recent past back in Venezuela. Venezuela is a country that imagined itself, until very recently, as a host of European and South American diasporas for most of the 20th century, especially after it became an oil exporting country back in the 1930s. Oil gave the country economic resources that made it possible for the upper and middle class to live what Fernando Coronel used to call a magical state, a state in which modernity and cosmopolitan consumption was assured. But this magical state somehow isolated Venezuelans from producing the large diasporas that other South American and Central American countries have experienced. Venezuelans could be tourists abroad, but the only real, sizable diasporic community that became prominent in Venezuelan sociological imagination was Florida's. In Florida, especially in the city of Miami, Venezuelans became Miameros. There was never a large Venezuelan diaspora, at least in our imagination, anywhere in Latin America or Europe that could compare with Miameros. This all changed after Hugo Chávez's death in 2013, when coincidentally, oil prices plummeted. This brought the most severe economic crisis in the country's history. The economic collapse very quickly became worse than the economic collapse during our federal war, which is the other great crisis in our history. Hunger, unemployment, lack of opportunities pushed almost 20% of the country's population to emigrate to countries in South America. Today, more than 6 million Venezuelans, a displaced population that rivals the Syrian refugee crisis, only in a country without a war, live abroad. This has drastically changed the way Venezuelans imagine themselves. And central to this imagination are sociolinguistic stereotypes that do not correspond with a model of the real diasporic person. But nevertheless, and this is the point that I want to make here, have become central and dear to Venezuelans. What I mean is Venezuelans that produce this imaginary know that they are not producing a model of a real person, and nevertheless are invested in these images. I argue that conjectures about Venezuelans, not necessarily descriptions about actual people, pervade the ideological imagination of this profound and sudden historical transformation. And I will show, through examples of online performances and communication, how Venezuelans construct a new diasporic conjectural sociolinguistic imagination. Now, how and how does that affect our ideas about intimacy and linguistic intimacy, and what kind of idea of linguistic intimacy I'm working with for this paper? The first thing that I always tell people that I do when I try to theorize intimacy is that I always remember that Edward Sapir in 1921 wrote that all grammars leak. They are not whole, coherent structures, but flexible, faulty, imperfect ways of organizing linguistic material. So yes, we usually think of them as structures, but only by forgetting all the leakage that happens during real everyday interaction. I believe, with Anthony Webster, this fact is central to any understanding of linguistic intimacy, and it should help us focus on what exactly we mean by it. Grammatical leakage has been central to theories of speech play and poetics in Joel Church's, obviously also in Jacobson, and Joel Church's work. And I draw inspiration for this idea because they show that linguistic structure does not map onto single coherent models of either language or social life. I want to add somewhat as a provocation to this line of thinking that linguistic intimacy produced at the moment of grammatical leakage is not fortuitous or rare, but actually central and necessary to create moments of close sociality, and they are also central to semiotic conjectures. The grammatical leakage is the moment where this guessing becomes more important. and more intimate. Linguistic oversights and what could be considered mistakes by some are central conditions of possibility for linguistic intimacy. It is not that these oversights and mistakes are erased or necessarily below our linguistic awareness, but simply that they produce a familiar, sometimes even comforting, affective space between individuals that have developed mutual recognition. The reason for this is that intimacy requires recognition between subjectivities, and such a thing is achieved when we are open to each other and willing to take the products of our activities, speaking, singing, dressing, eating, and so forth, as things that make sense to us in their imperfection, bringing us together. Now, this point has been made also by Elizabeth Povinelli, right? Who, in her Empire of Love, shares a story that I think is been very touching to me and very central for me in trying to understand this form of intimacy, of a recurrent wound that on her back that is regularly misdiagnosed by doctors in Canada and the US. This wound is treated by doctors in Australia as a staph infection, common among Aboriginal communities, where she has created some of the most intimate relationships in her life. And she knows that these wounds, these things that make her skin disgusting for her potential love partners in the US, make people here worry about getting close to her. At the same time, she knows that her intimacy with people in Aboriginal communities means that she will be exposed to these wounds and infections for as long as she goes there. This creates a paradox, bringing the questions of what kind of people are unwilling to be with us because of our bodies are not kept up to a standard. Povinelli's unwillingness to stop doing fieldwork because of her wounds brings home the fact that our closest and most intimate relationships are those that demand of us to be open to the discomfort and imperfection and the material consequences of such relationships. Again, this is not a matter of tolerance, denial, or erasure, just like with with grammatical leakage. I do not mean here that intimacy requires us to tolerate others, but that intimacy is not built necessarily out of a single set of stable rules of interaction. The conditions for intimacy are not a negotiation. An infection cannot be negotiated. A grammatical inconsistency and leakage and an accent are just as embodied and pervasive as Povinelli's wounds. Those things will happen, and they are part for the course in our close socialities. The conditions of our proximity are material circumstances that are to a large extent out of our hands. At this point, I want to emphasize that I take Sapir's grammatical leakage, Joel Church's ideas about poetics and speech plays and theories of as theories of the actual material conditions of human interaction. It is in ethnographies of speech and discourse-centered approaches to naturally occurring instances of language use that Church finds the playful individual agency that forms the core of what I want to analyze as intimate relationships. But this playful agency is not unmediated. As Anthony Webster has shown in his ethnography of Navajo poetry, these actual material conditions of intimacy are projected onto linguistic forms. And with that, what I mean by that is that we do not, but with intimacy, we do not get close to each other without anything between us. There is always a third party to it, and oftentimes that third party is a linguistic form. It's always a semiotic form, and in this case, it is a linguistic form. Puns, for example, create among Navajo an intimate feeling since they require speakers and listeners to be on the same page to work. Webster then shows how a speaker creates feelingful attachments to linguistic forms. Now, once you have created feelingful attachment to linguistic forms. The most common thing that happens is that people will evaluate you for creating that feelingful attachment to linguistic form, or that you will evaluate others. Now here, I want to take a slight methodological detour and see how people take those relationships to linguistic forms as reflexible, to reflect about themselves, not to reflect about others. I want to show how grammatical leakage is recognized by some some of those who have moved out of the country of Venezuela, expanding obviously the number of places across the world where there are now Venezuelans in the diaspora. In all of these places, Venezuelans are facing different linguistic challenges. And here I want to concentrate on this diverse experience, how this diverse experience has been articulated in online social imaginaries, and how that has helped Venezuelans generate spaces of intimacy and self and mutual recognition. Now, one of the things that I want to emphasize also before we go into seeing the videos that show Venezuelans doing actually this is that not only are Venezuelans producing an imaginary about themselves, but they are producing an imaginary about themselves that is conscious of his conjectural nature. That Venezuelans are not kidding themselves about producing this and thinking that they really are or behave this way, right? So I want to present a first video, right? And this video is Joanna Hausman. Joanna Hausman is a Venezuelan comedian. Not this one, that, right? Joanna Hausman is a Venezuelan comedian, and I am not presenting a transcription of the video. And one of the things, you closed it. It's okay. So one of the things that I want to point out is that the video is in English and Spanish, so that this one is going to be easier to follow. And then I'm going to present videos that are in Spanish, but you don't really necessarily need to know Spanish to see what is happening, and I will explain what happens in that, right? And if you have seen some of my talks in the past, and you will recognize this video. I've been using this video for other talks because I think it is a thing that is I watched it many times and make me think about what is going on there. Yeah. Please try. It's okay.
No, I'm still on hold. Yeah.
Right.
Hello, thank you for calling Raptor Insurance. I see you have an account with us. Is this Miss Hausman?
Este tipo como que habla español, pero ya va, no le puedo preguntar, va a pensar que estoy insultando su acento. Coño, ya va, ¿qué hago?
Hello. Are you still there?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. This is Miss Hausman. I wanted to change my billing address. Como que. Yeah.
Verga, esta chama. ¿Será? Yeah. What's the new billing address?
The new billing address is 234 Las Aguas Street. I mean, La Jagua. La Jagua. La Jagua. La Jagua.
Did you just say La Jagua?
Chamo, yo sabía que.
¡Ay, yo sabía!
Coño de tu madre, no joda.
¿Cómo está la vaina?
Coño, no joda, vale. Qué huevonada es.
Ah, coño de tu madre, no joda.
Ya, ¿no?
¿Cómo está la vaina?
No joda.
¿Qué onda, chiquillos? No, espérate.
So in the example presented here, right, Venezuelan comedian Joanna Hausman is actually presenting obviously a fictional situation in which she calls a customer representative. As soon as she starts talking on the phone, she suspects her interlocutor to be Venezuelan. For this, she relies on phonological cues, right? And what she pays attention to are phonological leakages in the customer's representative English. She takes indexical of this person's identity. These phonological cues present the material conditions for Joanna to recognize a familiar voice. She wonders if the person on the other side of the line is a Venezuelan. Likewise, the customer representative goes through the same process in the other direction. The representative tries to stay professional, asking Joanna for her address. And as soon as she starts giving her address, she decides that instead of a standard pronunciation of Las Aguas, she can produce the Venezuelan Las Aguas. Notice the last fricative, right? A form in which glottal fricative sound substitute the alveolar fricative, right, in the final position. Right? She produces this non-standard form to give her interlocutor a cue. Now, this is not a thing that I grew up trying to recognize in Venezuela, that Venezuelans will use back in Venezuela, right? This is not a thing that produces any form of recognizable identity that you can grow up with in Venezuela. But what happens when someone moves and becomes a diasporic subject? This thing, right, becomes then a point of focal attention, that then mediates the relationship of, and what Joanna does here is that she on purpose produced the grammatical leakage, right? She on purpose produced the imperfection in order for this person to recognize it. What happens immediately after is that they become completely rambunctious. They start swearing at each other. They start talking about if they knew each other forever, something that actually will never happen. But what shows is the kind of joy about finding this semiotic form that you have been using in this context. And what is happening then is that the intimacy between them becomes instantaneous, right? They call, I mean, if you notice, if you're Venezuelan or if you speak Spanish, you will notice that Joanna Hausman will call him coño de tu madre. It's like she call him motherfucker immediately, coño de tu madre. And then she starts banging the table, and he starts saying no that, and he will elongate it, no that, which is something that Venezuelans do when they are very, very good friends, right? It's a salutation with joy that in reality you will never do if you are in Venezuela just meeting someone off the phone. So why does that happen abroad, right? And why does that happen after you produce on purpose? And why is, and to begin with, why is Joanna Hausman, to begin with, speaking Spanish with standard phonology abroad anyways, right? It's like that's the other thing that gets me about the video, is that she is exaggerating the standardness of her own speech in order to produce the contrast that will be taken as a focal point of attention. Meaning, again, we get closer, but we cannot get closer other than by a mediated process in which we have to take a semiotic form, in this case, a linguistic form, in order to get closer to each other. These are not, again, this is not a normal interaction between Venezuelans. This is a conjectural situation that Joanna produces to think about herself and about this guy's self, not about others, not about stereotyping someone, and not how about other people stereotype Venezuelans, but how we stereotype ourselves in order to get closer to each other. Right? Now, I want to show a second example, right? Let's see. let's go to the example. No, the one on top. That one. No, the number four. Number four. Yeah.
¿Cómo estás, mi hermano?
¿Cómo te va, muchacho?
Todo bien, ¿y tú cómo estás?
Chuta, weón, todo
No
bien.
sabía que estabas aquí. ¿Cuánto tiempo tienes que llegar? ¿Tú sabes?
Sí, pues si tengo 3 meses, güey. ¿Y vos cómo estás? ¿Y cuánto tiempo tienes que llegarte?
Yo tengo 3 años y pico y yo no hablo así, pues estás hablando así,
Pero
chamo.
así como, pues, chanchito, le pongáis color.
Ah, pues tú estás más chileno que yo, chamo, pues tú estás hablando.
Chuta, con que el chileno 100% venezolano, muchacho.
No, se nota. Con gente así yo no quiero andar.
¿Qué le pasa a este weón, culiao? ¿Qué le pasa a este refome, oh, chancho, weón? Ándale, vamos del cerro, weón.
This example is also very interesting to me because what happens there is that two people that actually supposedly knew each other back in Venezuela find themselves in Chile, and they start speaking. And the guy on the left has been living for 3 years in Chile, and he still keeps a Venezuelan accent, a very recognizable Venezuelan accent. The guy on the right comes to him, and he speaks with a very thick Chilean accent, but also with jargon that he obviously picked up in Chile. And the guy on the left say, well, why are you speaking like that if you've been 3 months here and I've been 3 years, right? And he actually rejects the sociality with the guy and goes away in anger. Now, this is also a thing that doesn't happen. This is an imaginary thing. And it's imaginary thing that has many layers, right? It's imaginary that someone with 3 months in Chile will speak with a complete switch to a Chilean accent. It is imaginary that a person that has been 3 years in Chile doesn't have any phonological or feature of Chilean Spanish, right? So the purity of the guy on the left is imaginary. The complete switch on the guy on the right is completely imaginary. And what happens is, right, that there is an imagined rejection of sociality out of that, which is exactly the opposite that Joanna and the other guys do, right? So this rejection of sociality is also conjectural. It is also, it is done online as a warning tale of what could happen to you if you completely switch to a Chilean accent too fast, and if you completely reject the Venezuelan, what a Venezuelan accent will be in Chile, because in Chile, a Venezuelan accent will be considered a grammatical leakage, a grammatical wound, just like the wound in Elizabeth Polinelli's back, that will be somehow shameful for that, right? Now, Venezuelans also, out of this rejection of sociality, have come to try to imitate and try to navigate this. And one of the things that I want to point out, that also these are Venezuelans moving because, and this is something that happens in Venezuela a lot. It's like people are moving to Spanish-speaking countries; they're not going to have any problem. The Venezuelans find this kind of conjectural things all the time. Now, if you move to the video that is, and this is a very recent Twitter video that I came across to a few like a week or two ago. Yeah, no, you will see the effect of this conjectural relationship. Yes, that one. Right. This is a guy.
Soy de acá, principalmente. Yo soy de Venezuela.
Ah, ya.
Entonces no conozco todos los dejos.
Pero tu dejo no es muy venezolano.
Porque ya llevo 4 años acá.
¿Y se te va yendo?
Me acostumbré al acento del limeño para no recibir un poco de esa percepción de rechazo en sí.
¿Hablas en serio?
En serio.
Un ratito, por favor. ¿Cómo eres el primer venezolano que... Primero eres el primer venezolano que encuentro que no habla como venezolano Y la razón que me das me ha dejado un poco en shock.
Claro, porque es una realidad muy fuerte cuando yo digo, hola hermano, ¿todo bien? A cuando yo te digo, hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Me das un sol de pan?
Con la cantadita limeña. Hola, ¿qué tal?
Claro,
En verdad has adaptado tu...
es que yo no soy de acá,
¿De dónde eres?
principalmente.
Now, if you pay attention to the phonology or the phonological features of this video, one of the things that you're going to notice is that this guy is actually speaking like a Venezuelan with a little bit of a Peruvian accent. It's not that he's changing dramatically the way that he speaks, and nevertheless, there are a couple of features, a couple of things that he can sprinkle into his speech that will give Chilean Peruvians, in this case, and in this case, it's Peru, the idea that this guy has been switching to a Peruvian form of Spanish. Obviously, this guy has not spoken to this guy long enough, but can make that particular assumption because these interactions are instantaneous, because these interactions are short, because these interactions are narrow in their sociality, that Venezuelans can do some passing into these forms of other Spanish in South America. And this kind of rejection is the thing why these other imaginaries, this kind of imagined rejection that the Peruvians will do against him for speaking as a Venezuelan, are the kinds of conjectures that also bring him to imagine that these forms of sociality are necessary with Venezuelans, right? It's like, it's a push and pull here, right? It's like Venezuelans are imagining Peruvians. No, obviously there is a lot of discrimination, but Venezuelans are also imagining themselves being rejected. And Venezuelans are imagining ways of trying to get closer to other Venezuelans. And both of those push and pulls, these centrifugal forces that are playing there, what they are doing is that they depend on how you position yourself, what kinds of stance you make towards a particular semiotic linguistic material. Now, I want to show you, because this has also generated not only this vicarious forms of teaching through Joanna Hausman and to this other guy, but also this place of proficiency in switching. That Venezuelans are very proud of being proficient at switching and passing. And I want to show you a video of a guy that also displays this form of self-reflexiveness through conjectures in this.
¿Qué onda, chiquillos? ¿Cómo?
So this is a guy that he wants to show how easy it is for him to do it, to sound like a Chilean.
No, I'm still.
¿Qué onda, chiquillos? ¿Cómo? No, espérate, estoy hablando. Ya. Hola amigos, bienvenidos nuevamente a mi canal y a este nuevo video. Yo soy Alejandro Ordaz, por si no me conoces. Y si ya me conoces, es porque has venido a...
And he's a Spanish guy, right?
Eso. Ya pues chiquillos, les cuento más o menos de qué va a ir este video. Lo que voy a hacer en este video es básicamente hablar con acento chileno. Lo estoy haciendo en este instante, creo. Ustedes califíquenme qué tal estoy hablando. Se confundirían conmigo y pensarían que soy un chileno en vez de un venezolano. Y bueno, ya desde ahora no puedo hablar en acento venezolano, nada más puedo hablar en acento chileno. Entonces váyanme comentando qué tal lo estoy haciendo. Creo que yo lo estoy haciendo bien, de hecho me escucho y siento que estoy hablando conmigo mismo, pero con un conmigo mismo que es chileno, no venezolano. Entonces creo que lo estoy haciendo bien. Creo que lo estoy haciendo bien, chiquillos. Esto es bastante divertido, cabros. De verdad que me estoy divirtiendo muchísimo. Estoy teniendo mucha diversión en este video. De verdad que no puedo más con mi diversión. En mi primer trabajo.
So what this guy is doing, right? And I think it's very telling because in this case, it's very explicit. He is guessing about himself. And he's telling you to your face, you know, I'm switching to speak with Chilean accent. Evaluate me, he asked. Evaluate my Chilean accent. And in the comments below, I am going to try to tell you also, and he goes into saying to tell a story about him being a garçon, which is a waiter in Chile, and how he was made fun of because he had a booger, right? And everyone was like laughing at him. And one of the things that he does is that he uses, to a point that I don't know that a Chilean will do this, but he uses Chilean jargon and stereotypical words that Venezuelans Venezuelans associate with Chileanness to an extent that I don't know that a Chilean will do. It's like, to me, it feels exaggerated, right? For example, he uses where, right? He makes a point of calling every single dish with chicken, ave, which is the most common Venezuelan way is pollo, right? He does sound to some of the people that go into the comments to evaluate his Spanish, Venezuelan in some of his phonological features, but he does a very good job into passing, right? Now, he does that, and then towards the end, after 651, it's fine. What he does is something very interesting.
Eso fue todo el story time, eso fue el final de mi historia. Espero que les haya gustado este acento, esta imitación de acento chileno. Si les gustó este acento chileno, si les gustó esta imitación, allá abajo hay un botón de like. Al que tienen que apretar si les gustó. Si decides que te vas a suscribir a este canal, entonces también dale de una vez a la campanita que está al lado del botón de suscribirse para que te lleguen todos los, las notificaciones de que hice un video, de que subí un video. Creo que ya es momento de hacer un switch y de cambiar al acento venezolano, porque tengo de verdad las cuerdas vocales o no sé qué es lo que tengo. Cansado, estoy agotado de hablar tanto rato en este acento que no es el mío. Ok, listo.
So, and I thought that was very, very interesting, right? That his vocal cords are tired of speaking like a Chilean. I think that's very telling. He is speaking of his own self a split first, a split into Chilean and Venezuelan. That split happens when he switches accents, right? That he cannot articulate a Venezuelan self with Chilean accent or a Chilean self with a Venezuelan accent. So he keeps it neatly separated. And in spite of the fact that this is a guy that claims that he is working, right, in a restaurant for hours and hours, passing as a Chilean, he, in a video that just left 8 minutes, he makes a point of telling us at the end, right, conjecturally too, using his own body as the focal point of the guessing. It's like, my vocal cords are strained. It is not that he cannot think as a Chilean. It is not, so it's not a cognitive thing. It's an affective thing that is affecting his own body. It's like, this Chilean accent hurts me. And it hurts me in a particular, in my phonological cords, in my phonological apparatus. And I thought it was very, very telling, very, very, very interesting of how, right, these forms of intimacy are created, because this hurting on the body is the thing that prevents him from being completely Chilean, from completely switching and just speaking in a Chilean accent the whole time. And it gives you the sensation that there is a split between my public self outside of my home, outside of my house, where I can all day speak English. I mean, speak like a Chilean and come back home and rest. Venezuelanness, therefore, is a place of resting, of letting go, and of relaxing. Even though he is just speaking Spanish like everyone else, he's not switching to a different language. He's just using a few phonological features that he might also use at home. Because one thing that happens in this video that people don't notice at the beginning is that before he claimed to switch to Venezuelan Spanish, he is already using Chilean phonology and Chilean words, even before claiming the switch to Chilean Spanish. Chiquillos is not a thing that Venezuelans use. Chiquillos is a thing that Chileans use. Just start the video calling everyone chiquillos and speaking in a key that it is more Chilean than he thinks he might be. He's not gonna claim that, right? Because he's invested in this neatness and this separateness and this split of self. He's going to also compartmentalize his video in three parts: a beginning, a switch to Chileanness, and then a switch to Spanish, to Venezuelanness. So it's also this form of reflexiveness, therefore, create a space for him to rest. And that is the point, right? And yeah. So as a conclusion, right? These examples, right, of imagined Venezuelan intimacy and sociality show how the Venezuelan diaspora is imagining the process of becoming themselves and others, not just becoming other in Chile, but becoming themselves in a different way, where they have moved and how this move is affecting their view of the linguistic practices and conditions they took for granted in Venezuela and have become much more relevant abroad. Linguistic forms, right? Linguistic forms that will not bring individual speakers together in Venezuela simply because they are not considered out of the ordinary linguistic leakages. In that familiar environment, take on a much more relevant role when they get displaced to a context in which they will be treated as an oddity and out of ordinary. They become linguistic leakage as Venezuelans move across the world, leading them to embrace these recognizable signs to either become closer to each other or produce criticisms of each other to each other. And I will leave it here, and we welcome questions.
Thank you very much, Juan, for that wonderful talk. How do you want to do this, Isa? So
I'm looking at the chat and you look at the
okay, and you could check of the whiz pens, I guess. I guess if it's like this, I can see.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm gonna open the floor to questions.
Yes.
Juan, can you talk a little bit more about or not more, talk about who makes these videos, like the first video, who's producing video about this?
Well, Joanna Hausman is a comedian here in the US.
Oh.
She's a media person,
Oh,
so she's all over the place just producing that. The other videos are just self-produced, people that just wanted to do this, right?
Mm.
This guy, I don't know how it came to be that this guy wanted to have his story about being a waiter in Chile. It's a thing that Venezuelans want to show other Venezuelans how to be abroad. It's a thing that has become trendy in Venezuela to do.
Like a genre,
It's a genre of things, yeah.
I have a follow-up on Cece's question.
Mhm.
So like, who is in and how big is the audience for these videos?
Who is in? Everyone that is interested in moving to Chile. Venezuelans Google a lot how and where, and there are tutorials all over the place of how to move to Chile. Chile is a very popular destination for Venezuelans. So if you Google how to move to Chile, you will come across a huge amount of videos about how to be and how to sunshine in and how to, do things properly going there. It's almost is almost the equivalent of manual accesibilidad. You know, like you know those manuals that they used to make in the 18th century of how to be and how to properly behave. Like, but people do it online now for others. Go ahead. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for your talk. I liked it very much. I have a question about the second example. Because there are two guys, right?
Right.
One who is a black Venezuelan,
Right.
and the other one more indigenous.
Right.
So I don't know if I remember correctly, the guy that is black, he talks about how he has been in Chile for 3 years, but he hasn't used the Chilean accent. And I just wondering if that has something to do with his race or how he's being racialized in Chile and that sort of thing. Like how race plays a role in this, as incorporating this new accent when you're a migrant.
It plays a big role into this. I don't think this guy will be not let to have an accent, right? He will always have an accent. And one of the reasons is that Venezuelans also, and this is a part of this talk that there's still, I am still trying to work around, is that the racial imagination of the Venezuelan diaspora is really white. It is a white imagination. It's like Venezuelans imagine themselves in three ways. First, we're white, we're educated, and we are middle class. That's at the core of a lot of the Venezuelan diaspora, right? It is a Venezuelan diaspora that then position itself in this particular historical moment in Chile in contraposition to a much more discriminated against Haitian diaspora, for example. There is a huge Haitian diaspora in Santiago that for a long time also have had, at least until very recently, a much harder time to get papers than Venezuelans do, a much harder time to get jobs, and the kinds of jobs that the Haitians get are really different. And obviously, because Haitians don't speak Spanish, it is harder for them also to pass. Like this guy does, right? For this guy, it is like he painted as it is really easy to pass. Wow. It will be for a Haitian that is also black. It will be really hard to do a different, and it's very different from Venezuelans. And Venezuelans' position in that kind of thing is very racially distinct and different, right? It is a thing that we've been working to, and it's a dimension that we should take into account, right? Because Venezuelans are a peripheral subject in relation to the Chilean society and the Chilean state, right, and the Chilean institutions. But in contrast to other diasporas that are more racialized, and in contrast to indigenous peoples in Chile, Venezuelans have had a different kind of position. And until very recently, that's a thing that is also changing, right? Because it also depends on what Venezuelans, if you are coming from the north of Chile, if you are walking through the Andes and coming to the north of Chile, you are much more discriminated against than if you came to Chile by plane, right? Like my own sister got to Chile by plane, and she lives in Las Condes and whatnot, and that's a nice neighborhood, and she's not going to be discriminated against as a Venezuelan that came through the desert, right, of northern Chile. That is where Venezuelans have been subject to things like their belongings being burned in a public square, right? Which is it's a very different treatment. So yeah, race plays a huge role in this. Yes.
So thank you so much for this talk. It was so interesting, and the videos really helped to have a very material sense of how things sound. And I wanted to have to hear your thoughts a little bit about three things. So these videos they're called, I think, it matches what I imagine an indexical drama is, which I borrow from Provenzano,
Mhm.
because they're very staged and there's
Yeah.
you know the success and yet, as you explained, in the success of not actual real figures of personhood, there are imagined figures of personhood that we're playing with, and it's through this recognition of excessive selves
Mhm.
that people are recognizing another perhaps more authentic self, right?
Mhm.
Like there's just this delay
Mhm.
or dislocated way of seeing the self almost. So
Mhm.
you have to watch that drama and both people get the drama, get into it, and that's where reflexively you actually like, oh yeah, we are who we
Right.
are.
Mhm.
And in that space of constructing selves and through imaginaries, I wanted to know how you see that in relation to the history of Spanish, you know, like the imperial history of Spanish, and the construction of space and time in that moment of the lexical drama, and how people are placing themselves. Like, where is Venezuela, Venezuelanness related to the imperial history of Spanish? I'm sorry, this is such a broad question, but I like that it's like how we are, you know, making a pastiche of Spanish and also making a pastiche of Venezuelanness, and yet hitting back to that authenticity through the drama.
Right. So, and in relation to the history of Spanish in Venezuelan imaginations, the Venezuelan diaspora also, right? Like, there is a profound stereotyping of Chilean Spanish in Venezuela that Venezuelans carry with them into Chile. And that is that Chileans speak fast, Chileans speak with a little jargon, Chileans speak at least on standard Spanish for Venezuelans, right? For Venezuelans. Obviously, Venezuelans don't speak standard Spanish. But there is a lack of, and because of the newness of the diaspora, there is this thing that I think, at least in my imagination, in my graphic imagination, there is this chunk that the Venezuelan diaspora is getting to that other diasporas are much more used to, which is like being other in a different setting, right? Now, that said, whether Venezuelan Spanish is better or not in relation to the old colonial situation is a thing that is changing right now. The Venezuelan sense of centeredness about our own Spanish is being challenged, and that is what I hope to be showing here, right? That's a thing. That's the very thing that is changing. This imagination that we are closer to a standard inherited almost imperial kind of Spanish, and that's
it's embodied.
It is embodied, and that everyone else in Latin America can understand a Venezuelan Spanish, whereas a Venezuelan Spanish speaker can have trouble understanding everyone else. That sense of them, that centeredness is what is being challenged too. And that is what is producing these forms of rejections of and ideologies of a split self, as in the last example, right? It's like, all right, because Chilean Spanish is still a foreign Spanish for this guy. It doesn't matter how long he's been living in Chile. I mean, his own self he still like to imagine his own self as separate and as self-contained. I don't know if I answered the question, but I tried.
I have a couple of different, or unless there's somebody. No. I'm not Juan.
Yeah.
Super interesante. Thanks for the presentation. And I was thinking about authenticity too, and mediation too, because I'm gonna be all over the place. But so I see you laid out pretty clearly this idea that the phonology is mediating the intimacy or lack thereof, right? These grammatical leakages. And I was just thinking about more if we could talk about the context of the other, like the more meta-mediated aspect of these videos, and that the performativity that we were just talking about, and also the context of these videos and creating intimacy online with, like, I'm thinking of the guy saying chiquillos and having a very clear audience and creating sort of this intimate space on his channel. Same thing with Johanna, trying to create these sort of online communities that are obviously related to gaining money, right? Yeah, I'm assuming that most of these people are monetized to some extent, maybe they're not.
No, I don't know.
Johanna, I think maybe,
But
right?
Johanna-
I just because
Johanna
I've just seen her
definitely.
everywhere, right?
Johanna definitely.
And that's kind of where I wanted to kind of get into, so you could help, like, think through with us about the context of the newness, what you're saying about the newness of the Venezuela diaspora in the US, and how those grammatical leakages take on different meanings, right? Obviously, than in the Chilean example, because of the historical connections, right? And that and the history of Latinx diaspora here in the US, and the perhaps lack of Venezuelan representation in that idea of Latinidad. And so I was just thinking about that in terms of how in the Johanna example, we see how that creates this level of intimacy, that the shared Venezuelan phonology, or the leakages that reveal that shared phonology, and how that might, that works really differently in the Chilean examples that we see for all the reasons that you just laid out in the previous question, right? So maybe you could just help us think about that.
Yeah, well, let me see if I understood.
Yeah.
So the difference between, right, the specificity of the Latinx example, right, in Johanna, how that how the Venezuelans in the US get to find themselves different from Venezuelans in Chile, different from Venezuelans in Peru, to be Latinos to begin with, right? To be Latinx, right? Which is a thing that I have to sometimes explain to my own students in Prince College. Because so you're Venezuelan and you're Latino. Yeah, I'm Venezuelan and I'm Latino. The Venezuelans here in the US are one of the the newest, the recent arrivals, right? And that is exactly how being the recent arrival is the thing that is defining Venezuelans now in Florida, right? Venezuelans under that and under whom? Under Cubans, for example, right? Like this has signaled Venezuelan identity in the US for now the last half a decade, that Venezuelans have to perform Latinidad and perform a Venezuelanness to a community that is not also not used to Venezuelans, right? To Venezuela, not used to Venezuelans, and that is very, very, very different from what happens in Chile, where and there is one thing that happens in the diaspora here in the States that does not happen, or that happens in the case of Chile that does not happen in the US, and it's the mutualness of the recognition. There is this thing that Venezuelans do to Chileans every time that a Chilean points out a problem with the Venezuelan diaspora, and is that they point out that Chileans went to Venezuela first after Pinochet. Oh, you had your dictator and you came to Venezuela. And now we have our dictator and we go to Chile. Right? That mutualness, right? That mutualness is something, right, that at least in Venezuelan imagination should bring Chileans to a mutual understanding with us into how to be empathetic with each other. So Venezuelans go to Chile with the expectations of empathy and being recognized and being integrated. Venezuelans that come to the state don't come with that expectation. Venezuelans that comes to the state comes with the expectation of being peripheral subjects like other diasporas are. Now, being peripheral subjects also, because of this newness too, is also something that produces a lot of conflict between Venezuelans and other diasporas. And here I always remember my brother, for example. Right? My brother moved to Orlando in Florida, and he's always saying, he's always telling me, "But you can tell who is a Venezuelan in any setting among Latinos because they are the only ones who think that they are not subjects to the same rules as anyone else." It's like they are the only ones who are there. And it's like you see, Puerto Ricans have been here forever. They know how racialization works. They know how things are going to work. You see Cubans here. They have been here for a long time. You see Mexicans. This is how my brother talks to me. You see a Venezuelan, you will see them doing things differently. You will see them like that person who is crossing the street in the opposite direction. It's like it almost feels like that we're doing that still, right? That's the newness of the Venezuelan diaspora, and that has translated into also a newness into the ways in which Venezuelans articulate themselves as Latinx. And it doesn't. It interferes with this sense of whiteness also that a lot of Venezuelans carry with them. This sense of we come from a society that is a racial democracy, and we are all mestizos, or we imagine ourselves as white. And why are people here discriminated against us because of that? What does that have to do? You will see a lot of that, or at least accusations in the imagination, in the forms of stereotypes, self-stereotypes that Venezuelans use to refer to themselves. So yeah, I mean, it is a very different thing in Chile and in Peru and in Ecuador, and in Argentina than it is here in the States. And that doesn't mean that in South America there are no variations. I mean, it's very different to be in Lima than to be in Santiago than to be in Buenos Aires than to be in Colombia, which is the largest one. And there is one thing that happens to Venezuelans in South America that is a little different from Venezuelans in the US, that I need to explore a little more, and it's the way in which Venezuelans become Beneco. Beneco, right, is kind of like Angie's Reyes Coño. The Coño figure. It's kind of like that. It's like that's form of self-stereotype. But being Beneco in Colombia, which the term originated, right, to refer to Venezuela as being Beneco in Chile, and being Beneco in Argentina, and being Beneco in the US, are very different things. And I wonder, right, ethnographically, this is a thing that I need to explore a little more. What does it mean to be Beneco in terms of authenticity of Venezuelanness? And what does it mean to be Beneco within a Latinx identity here that is not available in other parts?
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, it was long.
You made sense of my convoluted question.
I had a question as well, and thank you for the talk. Really enjoyed kinds of things you brought together. And I'm going back again to the notion of authenticity. I think earlier on you said that you're interested in decentering the idea of the self or the speaking person and instead focusing on conjectures. And for the sake of this question, I just want to bring back the self to the center. So in all the examples that we saw, there's a focus of attention on phonetic features. But as Isa pointed out, through that evaluation of phonetic features, what's really going on is an evaluation of the kind of cultural persona or figure of personhood that is indexically produced by using certain kinds of phonetic features, right? So in one example, you have this phone call where she recognizes certain phonetic features and she says, hey, this is fully a Venezuelan, and they immediately jump into a certain kind of lovely intimacy. And in the other case, it leads to the opposite sort of reaction. And I was thinking very often in these kinds of scenarios, on one level, sure, there's a focus of attention and evaluation of the kind of cultural figure that's being produced through language use, but there's also an evaluation of the degree of authenticity or genuineness or earnestness with which that figure is being produced.
Right.
And so I guess my question is, if we look at all of these performances as various kinds of stylistic variations, what kinds of factors do you think go into making any such stylistic performance felicitous or successful? And what kinds of performances lead to this visceral discomfort or cringe when someone overdoes it? That was excessive. He's trying too hard. He's not being himself, right? So I guess what I'm really curious to hear is within these language ideologies that place certain ways of speaking within a hierarchy, there's also another implicit ideology which has to do with the self, the appropriate comportment of the self. What is too excessive a performance? What's not enough? And I'm just curious if to hear your thoughts on like how these kinds of thresholds of where the line between appropriate and far too excessive, how that changes between diasporic spaces, within non-diasporic spaces, and yeah.
Right. I think there's a matter of the authenticity of this performance is in the eye of the beholder, right? And it's not a thing that people can evaluate from a particular kind of set of qualities of the performance itself, right? Because the performance itself is exaggerated to begin with, right? So now the thing that I think that defines the most the feeling of closeness to the semiotic forms. And I do not want to be too Bourdieuian here and say it, right, that is the person itself. I mean, power is on the speaker and not on the performance itself. But Joanna Hausman, for example, Joanna Hausman is a beloved comedian. I mean, she is performing this exaggeration, and if she would have done it a little different, people would have loved it still. And people in the Venezuelan diaspora are looking for an excuse to produce, and this is another part of this authenticity. People are looking for an excuse to produce this sociality, right? And for as long as the need for an excuse of sociality, right, the condition is that the affective and the emotional need for sociality is there, you're going to find the excuse for that, the mediating excuse for that. Meaning that it's not a characteristic of the speech itself, but the need for sociality and the quality that you find, that you identified as the sign that will mediate that, is kind of random. It's kind of random. That phonological feature, that fricative, that in La Hawas, something that, I mean, no Venezuelan imagination grew up paying attention to. We say La How. All of a sudden that becomes relevant. It's random. It's absolutely random, and it's only because Joanna, at that particular moment, she randomly pointed that out, that we do that. It would have never occurred to me in a million years that a fricative will do that to anyone. The no Venezuela. All of a sudden it did. Is it because it's more authentic? No, it's because it is excuse in that particular moment to produce that articulation itself. Right? Now, when does that become excessive? We will have to see on the conditions in which that need for sociality is not so relevant or not so dear or not so in need, right? That people are not, because it's, again, it's in the eye of the beholder, it's in the eye of the person that's seeking that. And I assure you, I mean, obviously, there will be Venezuelans that are in less dear condition to try to find this form of sociality that will say, that's irrelevant, right? But that saying it is irrelevant, it speaks about also the conditions in which those Venezuelans live, right? It's like, I think that those things are overlapping and those things explain each other like that.
That's really interesting. Can I just a small follow-up question? Yeah. So like you're saying that there is such a strong desire to produce this kind of sociality. So it's almost like everyone is on the verge of looking for an excuse to find a little opening to create that intimacy. Yeah. My question is, despite that strong desire and that need for sociality, in your research, do you come across moments where it fails? In my work, I'm really interested in these kinds of performances failing and what that produces, right? And again, so going back to like thinking of all of these as stylistic performances, Konstantin Nakasis has this really nice phrase when he talks about style. He says stylistic performance involves the tentative turning towards something on
Yeah.
which the shadow of its own denial already falls, right? Like
Right.
you have to hold it at an arm's distance. You can't really commit too hard.
Right.
And also to relate it to like Angie's example of the conyo, right? In all of those evaluations of that particular kind of speaker within Philippine upper class schools or whatever it is, there's always a distinction between fake conyos and authentic conyos. And the fake conyos are always the ones who try too hard. They want to be conyo.
Yeah.
And that immediately renders their performance unfacilitous and something you want to distance yourself from.
Right.
And so I'm just like trying to push back a little bit, despite this very strong need and desire for sociality amongst diaspora communities. Are there other kinds of factors which still prop up certain barriers and lead to sudden disavowals from that identity? Like you're looking for
Right.
Venezuelanness, but then you encounter it in a register which is far too uncomfortable, and you suddenly don't want to have anything to do with it.
Right.
Yeah, just
that
like,
happens. That happens more frequently, not necessarily with these phonological features, but with articulating a Beneco identity. The Beneco thing, and here's the thing: people here in the States, and here's the kicker of that. A lot of Venezuelans that reject the idea of Beneco assimilate being called Beneco with the N-word in the US.
Right.
So they want to make a parallel. So is Beneco the Venezuelan N-word? And if it is a Venezuelan N-word, do we have to reclaim it? Right? So there is this boundary. There is this boundary when it is too much. Being Beneco is too much. What is not clear, what's not clear is what is it that is too much. There is a sense that there is a boundary, but there's no sense of where, what is it, what qualia is it that I am going to identify as the too muchness of it. What is it that makes me too much of a Beneco? What is it? Is my act, is it my accent that makes me too much of a Beneco? Is it the things that I do that makes me too much of a Beneco? We don't, if I haven't found any any agreement, any common understanding yet of that too muchness. I know exists, as you said, and as Costa says, right? It exists because all of these things have this limit of the too muchness of it. The problem is that it's not being articulated to me as an ethnographer properly to identify it. And that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means that to me as an ethnographer, it has not been.
I love what you said about something is excessive, but you're not sure what that's. Yeah.
Questions?
Could I ask for clarification? So in the comedian Joanna's video, so the Lahagua, that thing she did, so was this something that was already associated with Venezuelanness in the diaspora, or did she the one who sort of pick this up?
She picks this up.
Okay, interesting.
She really picked this up. Like this phonological feature, and it's not exclusive in Venezuela.
I know, that's what's interesting.
It's not exclusive in Venezuela. I mean, that fricative is not Venezuelan. I mean, there's a lot of people that do that in Central America and in the Caribbean. It's the fact that became Venezuelanness, Joanna made it, and a lot of Venezuelans have made it that way. But it's not a phonological thing that is exclusive Venezuelan by any means. And it's not a thing, by the way. It's not a thing that all Venezuelans do. By the way, it became also metonymic of the entire phonology of Venezuelan. Just there. You want to say something?
Yes, but it's not related. Well, kind of. But what you were saying about the conjectures and the relationship with conjectures and the strong desire for sociality. So I was thinking about Irving and Dahl's semiotic model and how conjectures are part of ideological work. But in the case, what I understand of your examples that you have shown is that in the case of the Venezuelan diaspora, conjunctures are not produced by necessarily, or maybe, but you will tell me, for they are not produced by ideological work, but more of an affect. Like they are there's this strong desire for sociability that is human, it's part of humanness, and that's what are motivated to create these conjectures to see, to perceive these particular phonological uses of language. I don't know, like I was thinking if there is a ideological work behind, like in the case of Johanna, comes from, I think she's Venezuelan elite, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if there is a project there forming to create this community, diasporic Venezuelan community.
Well, she's
to unify.
Right. She's trying to create a public, that's for sure.
A public, okay.
She's trying to create a public, an audience, and a public. Right? She's building audience and constructing a public. That's for sure. Is our conjectures part of ideological projects? Yes and no. Yes and no, right? They are obviously part of it. And if you consider those affective states part of the ideological formations, then they're ideological. I mean, if they are not ideological in the sense of being just mere ideas, though, right? Being just these conjectures are not just metapragmatic narratives, but they are filled metapragmatic things, objects that people need to actually attach themselves to. Right? So in that sense, if we're going to call them ideologically, it has to be extended ideologically, right? We have to extend it to a form of affective state and bodily consciousness. That's also a thing that I've been working with about to extend those things.
I have a follow-up. So are there any other specific linguistic features that are coming to be and registered as Venezuelan that you've noticed?
In these videos?
Just in general in your work.
In general, okay. There is one thing that that Venezuelans do, right? That is not shown in any of these videos, but it's been very contentious, and it's a feature of Venezuelan speech that produces at the same time intimacy, but intimacy that also produces this kind of a little bit of chain, and therefore producing intimacy in the sense of hurtful, right? That thing that is towards to others, and it's the use of marico, which is literally fighting, and we use it to refer to each other all the time. Marico, marica, and you will see it, and it is, and there is a split right now into what and how to use it abroad, because for the first time, because of the newness of the Venezuelan diaspora, everyone in Latin America is exposed to a Venezuelan calling them marica, or speaking and calling and saying marica, marica. And if you have Venezuelan classmates, probably you have heard them calling each other marico, marica, which can come across as very homophobic, right? And depending on where you are as a diaspora, that thing is going to clash more or less with the people that are around you. And I think that, I mean, the figure of the Veneco, the marico as a term of address, to address each other, or even as a discourse marker, right? And these phonological random things are things that might produce the too muchness for a lot of people. The too muchness for a lot of people. It depends on where you are. Also, there is this thing that depending on where you are in this in the states, depending on what community you are in the states. If you're in Florida, everyone understands that you're speaking Spanish and the weirdness of your Venezuelan Spanish. But if you are in Connecticut, if you are in Vermont, you are not, you get away with a lot more. And it's a little different, which is something that I want to see what happens with Venezuelans here in New York, which is also.
That's
Yeah.
active listeners. Any thoughts? No? Okay, well, our next talk will be on April 29th, as Stuart Dunmore will come. And it will also be a hybrid event, so please feel free to come. The recording, as I said, will be uploaded. And let's just give a first round of applause again for Juan. And I'm sorry for all the.
That's good.
Okay, so I'll stop the recording.
Yeah.